Another unfortunate aspect of European culture in the early 20th century were a couple factors that would become very important later on. One of which was called the cult of the offensive, which was the term was coined by a French general named Louis de Grandmaison, and he was actually killed in combat in 1915, ironically enough, once after the war, or about a year into the war. But he gave a series of lectures in 1911, which thrilled the generals in the audience. And the doctrine he espoused was called the cult of the offensive. It was around before he coined that term, but it wasn't quite so well organized into a singular idea. And the word cult really did apply because any French officer who failed to embrace the idea would find himself without a job pretty soon. So the basic idea was that the key to winning a war or a battle was an all out, nothing held back aggressiveness. And you just have faith in the power of men to wield bayonets to overcome any enemy. And that would become disastrous during the First World War. But someone who was a big fan of it was French General Ferdinand Foch, who was the commander of the French armies in 1914. And he declared in his books and lectures that, quote, the will to conquer is the first condition of victory, end quote. In other words, if you just want to win enough, you'll win, and you need to go on the offense to win. There's no such thing as, or there, to go on the defense is to lose. There's no such thing as a good defense is a good, it results in good offense. It's the opposite. So Grand Maison taught that, quote, for the attack, only two things are necessary: to know where the enemy is and to decide what to do. What the enemy intends to do is of no consequence, end quote. So you just know where the enemy is, you attack them, and that's how you win. That's the basic thought behind the cult of offensive, and it really disparages waiting. And there were some generals who said, you know, maybe we should set up our defenses against Germany in such a way that makes our troops wait and their troops overexpose themselves. And any commander who was part of the cult of the offensive absolutely rejected that. So that would become a big problem. Another unfortunate aspect of the military culture was the degradation of humanity. War obviously is an inhumane phenomenon, but it became much worse when you have social Darwinism connected. And social Darwinism really connected both these things. The cult of the offensive, in other words, you know, we can't lose if we're the stronger people. And this idea that came out in colonial warfare that less deserving people or less evolved people, the way they thought the social Darwinist means of uh, ranking people on a hierarchy, the people who were lower on the hierarchy, which means colonial people or any anyone really that doesn't fit a certain profile, there's no reason to treat them humanely. And this came to a head in these battles that occurred in German Southwest Africa, what's now Namibia, and which was a German colony at the time, and there was a revolt by the Herero people, the natives of the area, in which they revolted against the German uh, leadership. The Germans sent in a general named Lothar von Trotha, and he expected to win a decisive battle against the rebels, and instead of winning, technically he did win his battle, but what happened was that instead of destroying the rebels, they were able to escape into this desert region where they were cut off from supplies and assistance. So instead of trying to give them some kind of incentives to surrender or letting them disperse, he set up his troops in such a way where they would not be able to come out of that desert without giving battle, and essentially let them die out there. It was a huge amount of death among those people, not all of whom were soldiers, out in the desert where they just died of exposure and starvation. Following that, what was worse was that the survivors of the Herero, both the survivors of the battle and just people in Herero, people in general that weren't deemed faithful enough, were rounded up by the Germans and put in these prisons. And General von Trotha actually saw the prisons as a form of warfare. Concentrating people had been used in warfare before. The Americans used it in the Spanish American War. The British used it in the Boer War. The idea was called reconcentration, which means if you have an insurgency, you round up all the people who might be insurgents, put them in one place. That way, you know where they are and you can control them. And then everyone who's left outside that particular area must be an enemy, and uh, you can attack all of them. So General von Trotha put that idea to the test. He was so angry about not getting his decisive victory against who he considered savages that he was willing to basically kill who he considered savages, all the natives, with no sense of regard for women or children or anything. He was eventually removed as commander of the colonial forces there, but was never reprimanded. Actually, the leadership thought he had done a good thing. The question was to what degree uh, was appropriate. And so, this method of imprisoning people you don't consider fully human and using the prisons as a weapon, that's something that the Germans would definitely remember. And also, just this social Darwinistic notion of superiority manifesting itself on the battlefield was extremely powerful and carried forward for decades.